Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp, and I'm the Chief Digital Officer of DATAVERSITY. We would like to thank you for joining the current installment of the monthly DATAVERSITY webinar series, Real World Data Governance with Bob Seiner. Today, Bob will discuss building resilient data governance strategies in a post-pandemic world. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. If you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And just to note, Zoom defaults the chat to send to just the panelists, but you may absolutely change that to network with everyone. For questions, we will be collecting them via the Q&A section. And to find the chat and the Q&A panels, you can find those icons in the bottom middle of your screen for those features. And as always, we will send a follow-up email within 2 business days containing links to the slides, the recording of the session, and any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for this series, Bob Seiner. Bob is the president and principal of KIK Consulting and Educational Services and the publisher emeritus of the data administration newsletter, tdan.com. Bob specializes in non-invasive data governance, data stewardship, and metadata management solutions. And with that, I will give the floor to Bob to start his presentation. Bob, hello and welcome.
Hi, Shannon. Hi, everybody. Shannon, just doing a sound check to make sure you can hear me okay.
You sound good. I see your slides. All is working.
Okay, fantastic. So just to let everybody know, everything works great. When technology is working great, everything works great. I'm actually working from a different computer today, so just bear with me a little bit. Thank you for the great introduction, Shannon. As I said, I appreciate everybody taking time out of their busy schedules to sit through my webinar. I know this is an interesting subject for a lot of people. I know we're tired of talking about the pandemic and the post-pandemic world, but I think this is an interesting subject that we have to talk about. So we might as well kick off the year with it. Actually, I believe that this webinar is more about change management than it is about strategies for a post-pandemic world, because there's a lot of things happening in the world right now that are not changes that we're expecting, not changes that we're being asked if we want to accept them. They're just parts of the world. The pandemic, nobody was expecting the pandemic. When the pandemic happened several years ago, we've got a lot of other changes going on with the world. We had a point where everybody was leaving the office and going to work out of their homes and work remotely. And now we've got the exact opposite situation where people are leaving their offices, leaving their homes and going back into the offices. We've got the natural disasters taking place in California and the ones that took place on the East Coast of the US. We've got changes to administration. We got changes in companies. I mean, the bottom line really with this webinar is we just need to build resilient data governance strategies, whether it's for a post-pandemic world or any world that you are in. So let's make certain that we can change the slides. I guess it worked. Okay, very good. So before we get started, I just wanted to spend just a minute talking to you about some things that are coming up through DATAVERSITY. As you know, we do this real world data governance webinar series on the third Thursday of every month. Next month, I'm going to be talking about AI and data governance roles that match your organization's or any organization's need. Next week, I will be speaking at the Enterprise Data Governance Online Conference about the value of an effective AI and data governance joint framework. I'm also going to talk about the framework in today's session. I spoke about non-invasive, I published a couple books on non-invasive data governance. I have one that's going to be released in 2023 through DATAVERSITY. There's a whole bunch of learning plans, non-invasive data governance, non-invasive metadata governance, and one on business glossaries, dictionaries, and catalogs. You can always find me at kikconsulting.com. And as I always say, in my spare time, I'm also an adjunct faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University in their Chief Data and AI program, Chief Data and AI Officer program. So what are we going to talk about today? As I mentioned before, we need to be considering the fact that our data governance programs need to be adaptable to anything that's going on around us. The world is changing, as I just mentioned before. There's a lot of things that are going to impact our businesses that we need to address. We need to build resilience into our data governance framework. I'm going to share again with you the framework that I use for a lot of organizations, but we want to talk about how it really requires a level of intentional planning when we are building resilience into our governance programs. We'll talk about some of the new challenges in this new transformed and ever transforming world. We'll talk about strategies for long-term sustainability and governance, and really planning for the survival of our data governance programs. We know that as we're implementing data governance programs, that we're having a hard enough time in a stagnant world, in a world that doesn't change. But we need to be looking down the road as to what could be changing within our organizations, and we need to be able to adapt our frameworks in order to manage effectively in the transformed world. And the last thing that I'm going to talk to you about today will be, I want to share with you some success stories of organizations that have shown some levels of resilience in their data governance programs after the pandemic and as the world is changing. So as I typically do, I start out with a series of definitions, and I want to talk about the definition of data governance, being I'm not sure that this is the right slide deck that I'm using. I'm going to keep going with it anyway. I start out with some definitions of data governance and stewardship and what a steward is. And I always define data governance as the execution and the enforcement of authority over the management of data. I know it really doesn't matter what approach you take to data governance, whether you're taking that top-down command and control approach, or you're taking more of a traditional, we'll build the program and hope that people gravitate toward it. I refer to it as the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come approach, or whether you follow a non-invasive approach that I talk about so often. At the end of the day, we need to execute and enforce authority over data. And when I talk about stewardship, oftentimes I talk about the fact that potentially everybody in the organization is a steward of the data. If they have a relationship to the data that they're being held formally accountable for, they are a steward. So the first thing that I really want to talk about just in terms of the pandemic is, as the pandemic took place in early 2000 and into 2002, 2003. Some people may say that it's still with us now. There were a lot of things that it did to our lives. And in fact, I could have had multiple slides on this, but I don't really want to belabor the point of the big changes that came when the pandemic hit. And the truth is that there were 6.9 million confirmed deaths as of 2024. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of students were affected and are still being affected today. 10 trillion in global losses, a lot of vaccines administered. In fact, I was joking with my wife this morning that since we have an inch of snow in Pittsburgh today, that even our school system, they're going to remote learning. They're not, the students are not taking a snow day, so to speak, but a billion students were moved out of their homes and out of their schools and into their homes, and were being forced to work remotely. What did the pandemic do to the data? So first of all, because of the changes, because of the fact that people were working remotely, because customers' behavior was changing, there was an explosion in the volume of data. And that was already happening before the pandemic, but especially during the pandemic, we saw that there was an explosion in the volume of data. We saw that there was a demand for real-time insights within organizations. I mean, there are organizations needed to track not only COVID and things like that, but they also needed to track their customer behavior. And they needed to provide real-time analytics to focus on adjusting to supply chain disruptions, adapting to the way that customers were basically behaving within their organizations. And also, another thing that the pandemic did to us was it increased the privacy and the security risks. When people started to leave the office and work remotely, there were a lot more concerns in terms of data breaches, compliance violations. Basically, organizations have been struggling to protect their data up until the pandemic, and certainly the pandemic added some additional focus to that. Some additional things that the pandemic did to our data. There was certainly a shift towards different types of applications that were cloud-based rather than being managed in-house in organizations. So organizations were seeking to scale and make their solutions accessible beyond the confines of their offices. And so there was a shift towards cloud-based solutions, which certainly had an impact on the way that data was being managed and the data that was being governed, the way that data was being governed within organizations. It's also, even though, again, this started before the pandemic, there was a highlight, people started recognizing that they needed to govern more than just the structured data, the data in the databases and the tables and the systems. In fact, we did a great webinar on this last month where we talked about unstructured data and versus structured data and semi-structured data as well. But because of some of the changes that took place after the pandemic, the virtual meetings, the emails, and things like that, there was a renewed focus, or should I say a new focus, on highlighting the gaps in how organizations were governing unstructured and semi-structured data. In fact, if you talk to the folks in information management organizations and information governance and records management organizations, they're now starting to focus more on the structured data as well, or at least they're looking for ways to combine their unstructured and their structured data governance. So not only did the pandemic have an impact on the world in general, it specifically had the impact on you and me. I mean, people that focus on assisting practitioners or assisting organizations to implement their governance programs. So not only did it impact the world, it impacted our world. And I want to share with you a few of the ways that happened. Now, the first one is it certainly accelerated digital transformation. So, organizations are being forced, it's actually forcing organizations to adopt more digital transformation, focusing on remote work and digital operations, focus on exposing weaknesses in data management as well. I can tell you that during the pandemic years, it was some of the more busy years for myself personally. It seemed as though organizations were really focusing on improving the governance and the management of their data. In fact, more organizations asked me to clarify for them the difference between data management and data governance. So we noticed that there seemed to be an increased interest in data management skills within organizations that were kind of brought on by the pandemic and a lot of these other issues that we're talking about. And it certainly increased the organization's dependence for data for making decisions. Organizations were looking for ways to be able to navigate the crisis that was taking place to them. And so they leaned heavily on data to navigate the crisis, including from navigating the supply chain adjustments that they were living with, focusing on decision-making. These things were increasingly essential for organizations to survive. Shannon, if it's okay with you, I'm going to try to pull up another slide deck that I had made some changes to, because I don't think this is the appropriate one. If that's okay?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do that. I apologize for this, folks.
I'm going to stop sharing while you search. Yeah. You're good.
Let's try this because I think this will work much better. And I'm going to fast forward through some of the slides too, just to get to where we were, if that'll work. See, there were a lot more better graphics. Again, I apologize for the technical problems that we're having. I'm just going to fast forward through everything quickly. You knew eventually at some point, Shannon, while we were doing this, that we would have an issue like this.
Once every, 12 years, 13 years, 14 years. That's good.
Right. We're almost there, folks, so bear with us one more second. So again, what we're talking about is the pandemic and what it really did to our world. And it's the folks like yourself and myself and the folks that are actually governing and managing data as part of their organization. Certainly, I think we're actually past this. All right, let's talk about, again, apologize, folks, adapting data governance to the realities that are taking place within organizations. So, most people understand that their programs need to adapt. And as I said before, it's difficult enough to build a program in a stagnant world where the world isn't changing, but we need to focus on, building a framework associated with our governance program that's going to give us the ability to be able to adapt and to adjust to changes that are taking place around us, whether it's the pandemic or changes that are taking place due to natural disasters or organizational changes or any of the changes that I mentioned earlier. I want to talk about some of the things that we need to do in order to adapt our governance programs to the realities of what we're being hit with in the world. So we're first going to talk about emphasizing agility in the governance frameworks. Then we're going to talk about strengthening the governance of remote and distributed data within the organization. And then, as I mentioned before, there seems to be a convergence. And I believe we've done a webinar on this where we talked about the convergence of unstructured and semi-structured data. We talked about it in last month's webinar, where when we're talking about artificial intelligence in today's modern organization, that AI doesn't really care where the data came from. It could be structured, unstructured, semi-structured, but we want to talk about that a little bit as well. So the first thing that I want to talk about is having a data governance framework and the importance of having a data governance framework. Just to let you know, in next Wednesday's presentation as part of EDGO, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about using the framework that I'm going to share with you here in a minute, and adjusting it and balancing it to be used for AI governance as well as data governance. So you need to be able to have that level of agility to be able to pivot your organization when there's changes that are being forced upon you, or when there's changes that are being decided for you within your organizations. So if you've attended these webinars in the past, I've shared the data governance framework that you can see on your screen. I'm going to make it bigger here in a minute, but I'm not trying to sell to you my framework for data governance, but there's a lot of frameworks that are out there, and whatever framework it is that you're going to select, just make certain that it is adjustable enough, that it's flexible enough, that if the data that is needed at different levels of the organization changes, or the roles within the organization change, that you can adjust your data governance framework to whatever those changes that are being hit with by your organization. And so what I want to do is I want to expand the framework here for a minute, just to give you an idea as to why I believe that this can be flexible. Because when you look at the different aspects of it, I just highlighted the components, the levels of the organization, and then the things that I referred to as the bridges between those components and those levels. So at some point in time, you're going to want to know every piece of information within this framework. You're going to want to know how to communicate at the different levels of the organization, the metrics and the measurements that are important at the different levels of the organization. So again, I'm just suggesting to you that whatever the framework it is that you're going to use, you want to make certain that it's adjustable. I always tell people that those core components across the top of the framework, or even the levels down the side of the organization, down the side of the framework, if they don't match your organization, then you should be able to adjust and make changes to the framework that are appropriate for your organization. So I'm just going to use this framework as kind of the context for what I'm talking about here. We need to focus on the fact that, well, first of all, when the pandemic hit, there was certainly a shift from working within the office to the remote work. And that shift of taking people outside the office not only brought on vulnerabilities in the data itself, but it brought in difficulties or changes to the way that we needed to manage making data accessible to people that were working remotely. So, organizations need to make certain that they're implementing. This is certainly one of the ways that organizations need to adapt their program, is to make certain that you can implement these policies, and these policies are adjustable, based on the what's going on in the world at that point in time. So implementing robust policies for securing remote access, hybrid environments, all of these things are really important to organizations. And there's certainly a way to be able to adapt your organization to post-pandemic realities. I mentioned before the need to be able to govern all types of data, and how AI doesn't really care where it gets its data from, whether it's structured or unstructured or semi-structured. And these types of data, just look in the second paragraph of what I posted here. Due to the changes that have taken place within organizations, it seems as though there has been an increase in the volume of structured data, of unstructured data and semi-structured data within organizations. So we need to be able to adapt our governance programs, not only to the location of the data, the location of the people accessing the data, the different types of data that are important to our organizations in order to implement effective governance programs. So another thing that we need to think about is, how do we build this resilience? How do we build this ability to be able to adjust or take advantage of, or at least be able to handle the changes that are happening within our organizations? We want to embed that flexibility into our programs. We need to prioritize. People were talking about data quality and data accuracy as foundations for their governance and their data management way before the pandemic hit. We need to make certain that we can continue to prioritize quality and accuracy, basically as the foundations for resilience. And then we also need to look at the technologies that are available to us, and how technologies are blossoming and growing, and their abilities are blossoming and growing, and how they can be handled to build that resilience into our governance framework. So the framework itself must be flexible enough. Before, as I mentioned, if there's a very prescriptive framework that you are working on or working with, it may be difficult for you to be able to adjust and to maneuver that framework to handle what is important to your organization. So the framework that you select must be flexible enough to adapt without compromising the way that the program is operating, or compromising data integrity or compliance of the data as well. So the pandemic certainly underscored the importance that our governing models, when changes like this take place, we need to be flexible enough to be able to ensure the continuity within the governance processes that are taking place within our organization. As I said, data quality and accuracy of the data has always been kind of a foundational item in the DMBOK, in most of the data management frameworks that you see. So we need to make certain that high quality and accurate data continues to be that cornerstone of the resilient framework. And we need to be able to make certain that we can make appropriate decisions even during crises. So prioritizing, so again, having technical issues here, incorporating another way to build resilience into your governance framework is to incorporate technologies, and the technologies are changing. So a resilient framework requires that we use scalable technologies that are available to us, including cloud platforms, AI, and those types of things, modern governance tools. Certainly we need to be aware as the data landscape changes, how we can adjust and how we can use these appropriately within our organization. Jeez. Okay. So another thing that I want to talk about again is how do we address these changes? How do we adjust the changes? What types of challenges are we going to experience in this transformed world? So one of them is managing data from different sources, not all sources that are internal to your organization. So it's disparate and dispersed sources and decentralized sources. We need to govern that. When I mentioned earlier, some of the changes that the pandemic had was there was increasing volumes of unstructured data and increasing volumes of structured data, unstructured data, and semi-structured data. So we need to be able to address the challenges that are associated with those increased volumes of the different types of data. We need to ensure compliance in an evolving regulatory landscape. These are some of the things that we as organizations need to do in order to address the new challenges in the transformed world. So as people were moving from working inside the organizations to working remotely, and there became more hybrid environments of people working both internally and externally, it resulted in not only highly dispersed data locations and systems, but it resulted in highly dispersed people and their ability to be able to access the data. So some of the challenges that we need to address as the world transforms. So for example, with these natural disasters in California, there's a lot of people that have been moved out of their work locations as well, that are starting to work remotely. They're even talking about potential future pandemics or different vaccines that are going to be necessary to prevent pandemics. But we need to make certain that as these changes continue to occur and people are in the office, they're outside of the office, the places where we're storing the data are changing, that we need to be able to manage the data from the dispersed and the decentralized sources. And one of the things that we need to do in order to do that successfully is to ensure that people have access to the data, they have visibility of the data, that we're continuing to make certain that the data is secure, and that we're following all the rules that the government is coming to us and saying, the government in our industries are coming to us and saying that we need to follow. I talked about the increasing volumes of unstructured data. There's such as emails and videos and all these things that people are using more of, at least more of now than they were using pre-pandemic. And I don't see that changing. In fact, I saw a statistic recently that said that the greatest growth in data within organizations is the unstructured data. And so we need to make certain that as the types of data change from, we have structured data, but also concerning unstructured and semi-structured data, that we need to address the challenges that are in front of us due to all these different types of data that we need to manage. So we need to have tools that are effective for not only classifying, but managing and securing the unstructured data, while at the same time, there's a need to make that data accessible to people wherever they need it, and to make certain that we're governing and we're managing and controlling who can access the data, recognizing that we've got people all over the place, we've got data of different types all over the place. That's a challenge that we have in the changing world. The compliance rules are changing. If you follow the news, you see that there's new rules coming out of Europe, there's new rules coming out of the US, all around the world. So the regulatory environments are not getting less complex. In fact, they're getting more complex. Organizations need to make certain that the people who are using the data, that they trust the data, that we need to trust the stakeholders. We need to make certain that the data complies to whatever rules and regulations are something that we need to enforce within our organization. And so the last thing that I want to talk about before I share just a few examples of what organizations have done in order to become more resilient and to be more have a higher ability to be able to adapt when there are changes, when changes are taking place. This thing I want to talk about is the strategies for making certain that our programs are able to sustain. And there's really three main things that I want to talk about here. The first one is establishing that culture of stewardship. If you've heard me talk about stewardship in the past, you know, I look at the potential that, you know, everybody in the organization that has a relationship to the data is actually it could be a steward of the data if they're being held accountable for what they do. So typically in organizations, they don't start by trying to govern by having stewards across the entire organization. They try to do it incrementally. So establishing that culture of stewardship, a lot of it really depends on how do you associate people with a stewardship role. If you go about assigning people into stewardship roles, I see that there's a lot of pushback from people because they don't want to be assigned anything additional, anything over and above what they're presently doing. If they're just being identified as being stewards, that's great. If they have time in their busy schedules, perhaps they can participate as active stewards. I typically recommend to organizations that instead of assigning and identifying people as data stewards, they focus on recognizing the people that have relationships to the data that are being held formally accountable for those relationships. And that's all part of establishing that culture of stewardship. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We also need to implement metrics and look for ways to continuously improve what's happening within our organization. We need to, this is the last bullet on this slide, is something that I hear being stated, especially to executive ed students in the program that I work with at Carnegie Mellon, is that you need to take the initiatives and the things that you're doing as an organization, and they must be aligned with the strategic and the business goals of the organization. So that's one of the first things. If you wanted to reorder these bullets, you could put aligned governance with business and strategic goals first, and then you certainly want to establish that culture of engaging people within the organization, and you want to be able to make certain that you're measuring the things that you're doing and you're constantly looking to improve your program. So I talked a little bit about embedding stewardship into the organizational culture. That's really what non-invasive data governance is all about. Instead of going to people and either asking them if they want to be stewards or telling them that they now have a new responsibility as a steward, explaining to them that they're already stewards based on the fact that they have a relationship to the data as a definer, producer, or user of that data, and they're being held formally accountable for that relationship. So certainly one of the strategies to have long-term sustainability and governance is to establish that culture of stewardship. Whether, again, you're assigning people into the roles or you're just identifying them into the roles, or what I suggest is we want to consider recognizing the appropriate people and engaging them into that culture of stewardship and having them recognize that the things that they do with the data truly have a big impact on organizations. You know, another strategy for building that long-term sustainability in governance is to implement metrics and make certain that you're always looking for ways to improve your program. So key KPIs, key performance indicators, are typically required to evaluate how well the program is doing. I haven't seen too many organizations where they will let governance continue to grow and build if there's not any demonstration to them that there's business value that is being attained by implementing the formal governance. So whether we're tying it to the key performance indicators or those things that are important to the business, we need to have a way to be able to measure the success of our governance program. We need to be looking that if it's not demonstrating the level of success that we'd like, that we have the ability to be able to go through that continuous improvement cycle and build on the things that aren't necessarily working or are not reporting as demonstrating effective business value for the organization. And I mentioned that, I mean, they stressed this in the executive education program, is that all of the things, if you come into an organization as a chief data officer or a director of data management and data governance, you want to make certain that the activities that you're working on are aligned with the things that are most important to the organization. So as a strategy for long-term sustainability and governance, aligning the things that you're doing with governance, whether it's data governance or AI governance or information governance, is to make certain that you're aligning the goals and the strategies of what you're doing with the broader vision for the organization. I'm working with a client right now that is tying everything that they are doing to the things that the organization says are most important for them, to them. And I think that's a good strategy for organizations to take no matter where they are. So the last thing I want to do to see if there's any questions for this seem to be disheveled presentation of mine is I want to talk about some success stories within organizations and where it's been important to organizations to adjust and to change as the world around them is changing, whether it's a pandemic or some other major impact to the organization. So, you know, when we talk about, and I talk about retail, I want to talk first about a retail organization that needed to kind of pivot to e-commerce when people were no longer coming into stores to shop. You know, I was working with a convenience store chain that, you know, that sold gasoline outside the convenience store. There was a change in customer behavior where they would come and they would buy gas and they would leave. They wouldn't want to enter the store. So they needed to change their strategies. They needed to pivot to more of an e-commerce strategy that was basically driven by the changes to customer behavior. I'm going to talk about a financial institution. And again, this could be almost any financial institution where people seemed to leave. People seemed to have to work remotely, and they still needed to get their job done. They needed to access the data. The data was moved to the cloud. So this was a big institutional change in a finance industry. And I want to share with you just some of the quick things that they did in order to adjust to that change in a short period of time. I want to also share about a healthcare provider who saw that a lot of the data that they were utilizing was not just the structured data in databases and tables, that it was unstructured data and how they handled that change. So the first I wanted to focus on is just this retailer who pivoted to more of an e-commerce strategy, focusing on real-time governance. And the scenario was there was a big change due to the pandemic, just due to store closures, due to the changes in customer behavior. And so they experienced a massive shift in e-commerce due to the pandemic and to store closures. The challenge to them was that they were managing this increase in customer data, and they needed to ensure that they had the appropriate inventory in order to handle customer needs. But that was either doing it remotely or doing it online, providing the access to their inventory online, or if they were actually would appear in person. It was just a big change for this organization, and they needed to make certain that they shifted their governance of the data associated with this customer change and inventory change, you know, appropriately. And they weren't given a whole lot of time to make those changes. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to implement a real-time process to leverage the tools that were available to them. And so they were able to then kind of be more agile in the delivery of governance and be able to focus on the changes to the customer behavior, the changes to the volume of data that were coming into them. And with this one situation, they achieved, I don't know if it was exactly 30%, but they achieved a pretty high percentage of an improvement in operational efficiency. This bank situation, if you work for a financial institution, you might have had this same type of situation where all of a sudden, people are working remotely and they still need to access financial data and customer data. It may not even be just banks, but in this situation, I'm talking about a bank that had this issue. It could be any type of organization where people were no longer in the office and had the structure in place to assure that they could access the appropriate data remotely as compared to what the systems that they had access to when they were in the office. And again, like I said, this could be any type of organization, financial institution, any manufacturing organization where people are no longer in on site and accessing the data. They needed to change to be able to transform as a lot of their data was being moved to the cloud. And the last example I want to share with you is a healthcare institution that they were very used to managing data that was structured within the databases and systems in their organization. But all of a sudden, when there was an influx of unstructured data or semi-structured data, they didn't necessarily have an appropriate inventory of what that data was. They didn't necessarily have the appropriate people recognized and identified as the people who were the owners of that data. And data would become even more dispersed. So we talked about there being silos in the past. Well, when we start to introduce data of other formats into our organization, the use of our definition of domains of data or subject areas of data, it changes. It needs to adjust as we're starting to look at different types of data that are coming into organizations. So again, this is just another example of way an organization needed to adjust when they were forced to have those changes. It wasn't something that they planned for. And so it's one thing to build a successful strategy that will work within an organization. It's another thing to be able to adjust as there is a need to be able to adjust. So I apologize for the issues that I've had. Technology speaking, it's kind of thrown me for a loop, but I hope this makes sense to you. I know it's not the most popular subject of talking about the post-pandemic world or anything that has the pandemic in it. But we need to think about these things where the changes aren't done. The pandemic, number one, the pandemic is not necessarily over. And there could be another pandemic coming, but there could be a change that takes place that alters the way that your organization does business. And my biggest suggestion out of this webinar is to just be aware that those changes could come and make certain that whatever framework that you select as your way to move forward, as an organization, that it's not etched in stone, that it's adjustable, it's adaptable to the changing world around us. And with that, Shannon, boy, this was difficult today, but I'm going to turn it back to you to see if we have any questions today.
Thank you so much. It was still a great presentation, and thanks for kicking us off with these great points. If you have questions for Bob, feel free to put them in the Q&A panel. I saw some coming into the chat there, but feel free to put them in the Q&A panel just to answer the most commonly asked questions too. I will send a follow-up email by end of day Monday for this webinar to all registrants with links to the slides and links to the recording. So diving in here, Bob, what role can change management play in activating and sustaining successful data governance models?
Well, we need to be, what role does change management plays a role in everything we do. So we need to understand, so it depends on how you define formal change management within your organization. Having the ability to be able to adjust and adapt to things that are taking place around you or places or things that are coming from the highest part of the organization, change management has to play a huge role. In fact, I'm speaking to an organization right now that doesn't even use the name governance. They're using the term change management, and they're putting governance under change management. So change management plays, because without formal change management, changes aren't documented and recorded. Changes to people aren't documented and recorded. So change management, at least to me, plays an extremely huge role in the success of any governance strategy in an organization.
And are SMEs the best candidates for stewards?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Are subject matter experts the best candidates for stewards?
So typically when I define stewardship, I define it at a couple different levels. I define it at a tactical level where it's kind of built out by domains. So there's domains of data that impact multiple different levels of the organization. That's at the tactical level. And typically those stewards at the tactical level are considered to be the subject matter experts, the domain subject matter experts for that specific domain. And then I also talk about an operational level of steward who may be a subject matter expert specific to a subject of data within their specific business line. So again, the difference between operational and tactical is at a tactical level, and this is one of the biggest hurdles to get over for organizations, is recognizing those subject matter experts, to your question, those subject matter experts who have an impact and have a level of accountability across business units. And then the other types of stewards, like I said, are the operational day-to-day stewards within a business area. And there again, they are subject matter experts, but they are subject matter experts as to how the data is used specifically within their business function and not necessarily across business functions. I hope that answered your question.
Great answers. So, Bob, should change management be driven from the top down or the bottom up?
Whew, that's a great question. So I think I would answer that question, yes. There needs to be a recognition at the highest level of the organization for change, but oftentimes they're not the ones that can institute change that will be effective across the entire organization. So from the top down, yes, they need to support the need. They need to recognize that there's a need for change, but oftentimes the most effective way to implement that change is bottom up. It's starting in business areas, starting in projects within specific business areas, and implementing effective change management, and then kind of expanding that to other parts of the business or across business. So I would say, yes, it needs to be top down, but it also needs to be bottom up as well.
Perfect. So, how can we tackle data silos in a healthcare setting from a governance approach?
Wow. How do we handle data silos? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to come to the realization that we want to get away from the data silos. So, and moving away from silos is not going to happen on its own. So I'm really starting at the very beginning. How do we get away from silos? Is we need to recognize the impact that having the data being siloed like that is having on the impact that it's having on the organization. So then when you talk about, well, how do we then break away from the silos at more of a tactical and operational level? I'm not sure I have time to be able to answer that in this webinar, but it's going to take a decision to look for similarities in data across the silos, look for decisions to be made as to what the definition of data will be across silos. And then that's going to require at the operational level changes to systems to make the data work together or to eliminate sources that aren't being used. There's a whole operational piece to eliminating the silos, but I would suggest the first step is there has to be a recognition at a high enough level of the organization that there's a need to get away from silos, because people become very attached to the databases and the systems that they use. And if you're going to remove the use of some of the siloed databases or replicated databases across your organization, that's not going to come easy. You're going to need to have that direction from above.
Thank you. We've got lots of time for questions here, so keep them coming, everybody. These are great questions. So, Bob, you've mentioned a data governance framework. What other concepts in data governance strategies can be used to avoid data debt?
To avoid data debt. Well, the framework is, again, consider it to be a container that is going to be customized to each organization. So when you're going to, I'm not going to bring it up on the screen now, but if you think about the data column, what data is important to each parts of the organization, what roles are important at each level of the organization, and processes and communications and those types of things. If you're going to eliminate data debt, to me, I would consider that to be part of the process framework, the process column, the process core component of the framework, because it's going to take process to, if you have a backlog of things that need to be addressed within your organization, it needs to be, the problem with data debt is that it builds up over time, and you get to the point where you really don't have time to pay it back. It has to be built into the process that when something is added to the level of data debt, that there's going to be a focused effort to resolve to resolve whatever the issue is that's part of that data debt.
Perfect. So, Bob, so many great questions. How do you encourage or gather buy-in from someone to accept being a tactical level domain steward?
Well, I'm not actually looking for them to buy in. I guess you do need them to buy in, but in an example, say we always go to Shannon when we have a question about this type of data. I say, instead of going and trying to assign a person, I would say that, they're going to push back if you're going to give them something that they didn't already have. So certainly taking a non-invasive approach, I always suggest to look to see what you have naturally within your organization and try to formalize the role of those individuals, instead of coming to them and saying, we'd like you to take on the role of the data domain steward for XYZ domain. Well, you're not going to go to a person that's not already, to some degree, at least I hope you're not going to go to somebody who's not already to some degree playing that role within the organization. One of the core concepts of being non-invasive is to naturally look for people within your organization that are already doing it, instead of adding it to their responsibilities as something new. At least that's how I suggest that organizations start. I mentioned during the webinar that that's one of the hardest things to get over in an organization, or one of the highest hurdles to leap over, is to recognize who those people in the organization are that have the appropriate level of accountability to be able to make decisions for data at a tactical or a cross-business function level. So I think that's a great question, but if you go and you try to assign or hand it to somebody as something new, the way they are going to embrace that is going to be different than if you go to them and say, I recognize that people come to you. You're in a position where you have the knowledge within the organization to be able to answer questions, to direct the decisions that are being made, and we need to formalize that through the program. And that recognition, with it comes a positive connotation instead of a negative connotation of, oh, you're assigning me one more responsibility. It's the positive connotation of, oh, I'm being recognized because I have a certain level of knowledge that can be used of benefit to the organization. Great question.
Indeed. So, Bob, what's the best advice for a much needed culture change? We data governance can't get participation in our meetings.
Yeah. How do we get people to become engaged? Great. These are not necessarily topics that came up from the webinar, but one thing is, you've got to make the meetings meaningful to people, things that if they're coming in and you're talking the whole time about things that do not pertain to them, they're going to lose interest. They're not going to stop coming to the meetings. They're not going to be engaged in the meetings. So certainly engaging the people within these meetings, and getting them to be able to come to the table with issues that they're having, or just getting them to be able to participate in ways that are meaningful to them, That's really required, because otherwise, you're right, people are going to stop participating when they find that the things in the meetings do not pertain to them personally or within their area of the business. Another great question.
Indeed, some of these we could do a whole webinar on for sure. And it's a question we get asked a lot. So Bob, and we've got about a little over 5 minutes left now. So what are some example of KPI measures in data governance?
Some key performance indicators. Well, there's something that I've talked about in webinars of the past, which is the confidence level that people have in the data. And being able to, so that's one of the KPIs, key performance indicators, at least for the success of a governance program, is what confidence do people have in the data that they are using, as that they're defining, producing, and using as part of their job. So that's certainly a KPI. Another one would be the number, a question was asked about the backlog, about the data debt within an organization, being able to measure down or to bring down the level of data issues that have gone unresolved within an organization is certainly a key performance indicator for data governance. What I also suggest is in the webinar, I talked about this a little bit, is the importance of aligning what you're measuring to those key strategic, the strategy and the vision, aligning that with the strategy and the vision for the business. So look at the KPIs that are coming out of the business areas and recognize which of those, and I'm going to guess it's going to be a pretty large percentage, which of those KPIs that the business wants to see are data related. And then making certain, so for example, if there's a KPI that requires, I'm just going to, off the top of my head, say a half a dozen critical data elements within the organization that go into the compilation of that KPI. You certainly can measure, how many of those critical data elements, or CDEs, are consistently defined, produced, and used across the organization. Certainly when it comes to those metrics that you're providing to your senior leadership, this all comes back to improving their data confidence level. I refer to it as a DCL in a webinar that I did in 2024, is improving people's confidence in the data. So I would say, I gave you a couple of examples of KPIs, but what I would suggest is start with the KPIs that your business has defined and make certain that you're governing to the data that's going to hopefully help you to raise the confidence in those data points that are feeding your KPIs. So I think it's very important to be able to demonstrate the success. I talked about that during the webinar today. I wrote an article that's on LinkedIn about ROI for data governance, and it displays different ways that you can measure ROI. They don't necessarily all align with the KPIs. Again, I suggest start with the business KPIs, see what data is required for those, and focus that way.
All right. Well, we've got a lot of great questions here left. And just to let you all know, if we don't have time to get to your question, Bob will write out the answer. We'll get that in the follow-up email. So there's a couple questions here. So I just want to call it out, Bob, about governing unstructured data and semi-structured data along with structured organizational data.
So my suggestion is, if you have the time, please go back and look at the webinar that I did. It was a lot more coherent than this one, but the webinar I did last month was focused on kind of unifying together governance. Not only do we need to focus on the structured data that traditionally most data governance programs focus on, but there's a lot of similar, but there's also a lot of differences in similarities and differences in you're still going to have roles and responsibilities. You're going to still need to define all of those core components that I put in the framework that I shared with you earlier. Even for unstructured data, you may not call them definers, producers, and users. You may call them authors, approvers, and publishers of the data. But you can use, you know, please go back and look at the webinar from last month, because it goes into great description as to what the considerations are, the differences and the similarities between structured data, unstructured data, and semi-structured data, which is really a combination. It has a structure to it, and there is some metadata about it, but it's also not necessarily in a bits and bytes format that you would find within a database. So again, a great question. I would suggest go back and look at the webinar from last month and raise some questions then if they're not answered there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I just put the link to the webinar you mentioned in the chat for everyone, along with the, additionally, I put the link to the conference you're speaking at next week that you also mentioned. Enterprise
Yeah,
data.
hopefully I'll have my technologies issues resolved by then. I apologize for that, folks.
I think we all understand that, tech, like you said, tech is great when it works. But
Well,
that is all the time that I'm afraid that we have for this webinar. Thanks to all of our attendees who have engaged in everything. Thanks for all the great questions. Again, we'll get the answers out to you here shortly. I'll send a follow-up email to all registrants by the end of day Monday with links to the slides, links to the recording, and everything else. Thanks, y'all. I hope you have a great day. Thanks, Bob.
thanks, Shannon. Take care, everybody. Bye.